The fingerprints are one of the last things to degrade.
Yes.
And I thought that was very interesting because I've no idea why they're the last to degrade, but they seem to last longer.
One of the first things formed and then one of the last things to degrade.
Just a quick disclaimer, the content presented in this podcast is based on real events and may contain graphic descriptions of violence, crime scenes and other disturbing material. Listener discretion is advised. This episode is sponsored by Think Forensic.
Think Forensic are a one-stop shop for all things forensic science and crime solving. They hold experience days, as well as corporate events, team building events, and general education for primary school right the way up to university level, as well as other events and consultancy. There's also a shop where you can get your hands on all things crime solving, from evidence gathering to packaging and collecting evidence, as well as other forensic science equipment.
For more information or to book on an experience day, please visit the website. Hi everyone and welcome back to the Grave Secrets podcast. We're your hosts, I'm Annie.
And I'm Beth. Today is going to be episode 7 and we are going to be discussing the murder of a man called John Wainright. Unfortunately, the case is called The Body in the Freezer, and all will be unravelled, but it's actually a case that's been covered on the BBC. So it's a really good series, actually, isn't it?
It is. I really like this. There's actually 4 seasons of this. And this is, I've wrote it down, season 4, episode 1, if you do want to watch it on TV. And it's called Forensics, the Real CSI. And it's right up our street because it is so, obviously it's realistic because it's real. Yeah. But it follows like the CSIs. It follows the evidence step by step. You get to the police talk on TV, the people in the investigation talk on the TV. And it's like you get a real insight into the forensic background as well. It's not just saying we did this, it follows it through.
Yeah, it's like it's the actual behind the scenes rather than just the officers sat in an office discussing progress that they've made. Because a lot of the time they'll say, oh, and we've got these results back and we've got those results back.
Yeah.
But what this is showing you the work that goes into processing and getting those results in the first place.
Yeah, I do really like this one. I've got it on record and it is just the perfect one to watch to get the balance of like the entertainment and the realistic side of it.
Yeah, the one detail that I really like within it is actually the fact that they tell you where in the UK they are. So effectively you move with the evidence because obviously not all forensic experts are based in the same area.
Yeah.
So even though the case that we're talking about today was based in Birmingham, for certain elements of the forensic investigation, they went to Sheffield and we were like...
I loved that bit. Yeah. As soon as Sheffield came up, I was Googling it and I thought, oh, I don't recognise that building. So I zoomed in on the sign outside and I was like, oh, that's in Woodseats, that's near us.
Forensic experts
far
near
away.
Me. Yeah. Like looking for a takeaway.
Yeah, so it is really good how they just follow it step by step through, isn't it?
Yeah. So if we start at the beginning of this case... effectively, it all came to light when a woman that works for a waste disposal company said that they'd got a delivery as usual, but then when the workers had gone to process all of the different waste, they'd found this freezer which seemed really abnormally heavy.
Well, that's a warning sign in itself, isn't it? Because if someone sent a freezer to the waste disposal, you'd expect it to be empty and defrosted, obviously.
Yeah, and just for context as well, the freezer was like, I would call them ice cream freezers. It's the little square freezers that you sometimes put in your garage. It wasn't like a full fridge freezer.
Yeah, and it wasn't like at first when it said, because this episode is called Body in the Freezer, I was thinking, oh, a chest freezer.
Yes.
Like a big chest freezer.
Like you
and
see
it's
on the
not,
TV.
Yeah, and it's not like that either. So it was just one that you can just lift up and it wasn't even that big, I didn't think, in general.
But yeah, so the workers question the fact that it's heavy and they look inside and unfortunately they can't believe it, but they appear to have found a decaying body in there.
The lady rang up the police and reported it, but she said that I think it's a body.
Yeah,
and you're thinking, oh, how could you think? But then when we unravel later down in the case, you'll know why the body was obviously starting to
And they
decompose.
do actually show the CCTV footage, don't they, of the workers discovering it. And you can't even imagine them. You just, like your normal day at work.
And the smell as well, because you're thinking it's heavy, but anything could be in there.
Yeah.
And then the person who actually goes to open the lid, the smell's just going to hit you straight away anyway.
Yeah, it'd be abhorrent.
And then not only that, but what you've just seen will probably it'll probably have an effect on them as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And your senses are linked, aren't they? So anytime you probably then smell something bad, hopefully you're never going to smell the same smell. But anytime you smell something similar, it probably
is going to bring back memories.
Yeah.
It was horrible for the workers. So it was actually a full body that was found in the freezer, and it was decaying. And they said it had got like a putrefied remains were in the bottom of the freezer and around the freezer.
Yeah, and they actually looked at some other evidence. So the CSIs came out, didn't they?
Yeah.
To the waste disposal site, left everything intact kind of thing. And they found other things that had obviously just been bundled like with the freezer.
Yeah, so what they did is they traced it to what had come in, what other items had come in with the freezer.
In that same delivery.
And there was really big bags, weren't there? You know, like the bags they put rubble in when they're clearing like a driveway or something. There was a couple of big bags of those. And as they were dragging them out, they were getting things out of there, and they thought they might be able to go through and have a look and see if, one, there was any paperwork, so any documentation with any names on it, leading back to any idea who this victim was, because at this point there's nothing to identify this person, is there?
No, not at all. And I don't think it was at this stage that they discovered it, but didn't they have a sock in his hand?
They did. The sock was over his hand. That was discovered in the post-mortem. So is what they actually did. The CSIs came out to the scene and had a look, but then the body got removed from the freezer and sent off.
And they actually took the freezer then, didn't they, back to the lab as well to process it further.
And sent off for the post-mortem. So the body was then sent off, and then that's when they document everything from the body. And the guy who was doing the post-mortem was having a look to see if there was anything that could identify the victim, any scars, any tattoos, anything distinctive that was left on the body.
Yeah.
But he did say that the skin had gone sort of green in places, dark green in places, and black. So it was quite advanced in the stage of decomposition, which is quite difficult to then identify someone.
And the skin kind of slides away from the rest of the body when it's been that length
it's not
time as well, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's not the best to look at or to smell.
And it was Dr. Matt Liedl, I want to say, that performed the autopsy. Because I thought he was really engaging.
It was good, wasn't it? When he was talking about it, it gave like really, again, in depth.
Yeah.
I thought he was really good. And that's when he said there was a sock on the hand, and they thought that was a bit of a strange thing to have a sock just on one hand.
It is obscure.
But maybe if there was a sock on the hand, that hand might have been better preserved. So, I mean, it wouldn't have been intentionally for it to be better preserved, but it might have worked in the advantage of, obviously, if you've got one hand that's better preserved, you've got more chance of getting fingerprints.
So the investigation then obviously goes off in numerous directions. You've got different teams working on different things. And the next two things that they kind of show you is, one, processing the freezer for fingerprints, and then also processing the body to try and get an identification, like you say.
Yeah.
But then equally, the police are then trying to track back where this freezer has come from to gain a better insight as to...
The good thing is,
who the victim might be.
With a big company like that, with a big waste disposal unit, anything that comes in, they will obviously have a log of that.
Yes.
So the person who's brought that in, there will be a log of their van coming to the site, dropping it off. And the police actually traced it back and managed to trace the van that dropped all this rubbish off along with the freezer. And they traced it back to a council clearance company. So that's when people have moved out of the council houses. They send people in to do like a big clear out, ready to either get the place back to normal or redecorate it or get someone else in there. So that's a good place to start, isn't it? Because you've already got the company, and then you can trace that back and say, well, when you did this flat clearance, which house did it come from?
Yeah, and then who the tenant was.
Which property did it come from? Which they then did trace it back, and they managed to find out the exact property that they'd cleared out on that day.
Yes.
Which means that they can then go and have a look in that property.
Yeah.
As well.
So interestingly, there were 2 people said to have been living at the property, but only 1 registered tenant.
Yes.
So obviously they spoke to neighbours when they'd found the property and attended the scene. But when they did the house to house speaking to the neighbours said, yeah, there were 2 people living there.
Yeah.
And according to them, they thought it was a man and his son.
Yeah.
And it was a more elderly gentleman and a son who was maybe...
I think they said there was about 20-something years between them, wasn't there? So he could have passed for his son easily.
Yeah. And that they were living there, and that there had been some disturbances, hadn't there?
Yeah, there was a couple of disturbances, and the neighbour directly next door had said a couple of times, didn't they? Oh, I have reported this, like at least 2 or 3 times. I've reported the smell. I've reported a disturbance. So I don't know if the 2 just weren't linking together.
Yeah.
Because if he'd reported it to maybe the council, maybe they'd not reported it to the person at the property to go and sort it out. Or it just seems like some of the agencies were not linking up here.
Equally, though, if it gets reported because of a smell and they think, oh, well, we've already got this company coming out to clear the flat anyway, they probably thought, oh, well, we'll just wait till it's cleared and then the smell will have gone.
Yeah, maybe something's just in the flat that stinks. Or you never know with the way people live. Like some people don't live very, hygienic and don't take the rubbish out. And I know it wouldn't be as strong a smell, but it could be.
Yes.
You'd still get flies. You might get maggots if people have got like raw meat and stuff lying about. So, you just never know how people are living. So you don't want to judge either, do you? Or presume anything. Just to go back a little bit to the evidence when they got them out of the big bags that came in with the freezer. Yeah. I was thinking then, if you've got no way of identifying this person at all, what sort of evidence could you really be looking for in there other than documentation and paperwork? Mm-hmm. And the CSI mentioned that I heard her shouting over to the other people saying, make sure you take any drinks bottles out of there, make sure... you have a look at them for DNA, see if there's any fingerprints on any paperwork. And I thought, oh, that's actually a really good idea that I didn't think of instantly. You obviously think of looking for stuff on the body. You think of looking for paperwork. Yeah. But then obviously from the bottles and things
you've got
that
to
were
root through.
At the crime scene that they could root through and take, if you find a Coke bottle, they could then obviously have swabbed the top for the DNA and sent that off. Yeah. And actually got a DNA match from the saliva based from that water bottle or Coke bottle.
Funny, isn't it? Because if we went into a scene and saw a wine glass on a table, obviously the first thing you would think to do is process and swab it for saliva. But like you say, when it's almost separate, it's in separate rubbish bags. Yeah, the thought doesn't come as easily.
Yeah, it didn't until she said it, and I was like, oh yeah, why would I not have thought of doing that?
I would do usually.
This is the job. This is what I do. Why did I not think of that? So it was nice to sort of hear another person's perspective on it as well. The CSI who was working on the case, I thought she was really good as well.
Yes, I did.
The main lady that was on it.
Yeah.
So the main questions I think you have to think about in this, as we were going through it, I was sort of talking to the TV and saying, well, why would the body be on the freezer, inside the freezer? Were they put in the freezer while they were alive? Had they already died and then they were put in the freezer? How would you be able to tell this? What would you want to look at? What are the situation? And I know you can't, as a CSI, you wouldn't be able to sort of speculate, but you've got to piece together the story in some way, haven't you, to be able to then process it in your own head.
One thing that I noticed as well is we always talk about the importance of being vague.
Yeah.
So when you're gathering evidence, you can't assume or presume to know anything for sure until
Yeah.
it's been tested back at the lab. And one thing that I thought was really good throughout the documentary was the fact that no matter who was talking, all of them referred and used the phrase, this is me going all Englishy, they all used the phrase appears to be.
Yes.
And I thought, that's interesting, because it obviously just becomes habitual.
Yeah.
But like the CSI, this appears to be. And when he was conducting the post-mortem, he had the voice recorder so that he can obviously then get the notes. And he was saying, we have what appears to be, when he was noting down anything.
Yeah. And you think that's logical, isn't it? But you don't normally hear.
Yeah.
I don't normally pick up on that, whereas obviously you with your English, you pick up on stuff like that and language more than me. But the questions, and then you're thinking, well, who was he? And if someone else did it, would they have their fingerprints somewhere? Like, what would be the first part you want to look at? Because there's so many questions that you have when it comes to this. Yes, it was actually Dr. Matt Lyle, that was it, who did the post-mortem, and he said that he could tell that it was an adult male, that there was some greying hair still left.
Yes.
So he was going to estimate that the male was a little bit older or a little bit more mature, and I think he mentioned the moustache or the beard being grey as well. And the decomposition, he started to say, was caused by the bacteria, which isn't a problem when we're alive, because our body will fight off what it needs to. But when the body dies, it's actually the bacteria in the body that then overtakes, which then causes the decomposition process to start. So I like how he goes into like a bit of the
it gives you the reasoning
background behind it.
Yeah.
So when you've got a body there in front of you as well, you have to think, how am I going to get the evidence from this body in particular? And the main thing we go to identify people is basically DNA or fingerprints, isn't it? But in a case like this, when the body is that far decayed, you could look at the fingerprints and think, the normal methods might not be.
No.
We might not be able to do the normal methods like in this case. And the CSI did actually say that she wouldn't be able to use any. She said she'd normally do the fingerprint identification using powder.
Yeah.
And it wasn't possible in this case. So what she did is zoomed in really far on the fingerprints and actually just photograph them with obviously it's quite a high quality camera. And then when it goes into the lab, they can obviously then maximize that and look at it under a microscope. And
the fingerprint analyst as well, she said, didn't she, that again, we talk about like partial prints.
Yeah.
And they were really, really partial because unfortunately a lot of the skin had kind of decayed around the edges and there was only a small partial left.
One thing that I thought was really interesting is when they said the fingerprints are one of the last things to degrade.
Yes.
And I thought that was very interesting because I've no idea why they're the last to degrade, but they seem to last longer.
One of the first things formed and then one of the last things to degrade.
Oh, that's quite a nice way of thinking about it, actually, isn't it? Your fingerprints are there for life. Yeah. So when you've got the fingerprints and the fingerprint expert was looking at them in the lab, she would then run them through the fingerprint database, and you don't often just get one match back from the fingerprint database. So she put them through and she said they actually get 15.
Yeah, 15 initially.
Initial fingerprints back that could be a match. So then it needs a person to sit and go through all of the 15 under a microscope. You've got to concentrate so much, haven't you? And have a really good attention to detail to be a fingerprint expert.
So it's an algorithm that effectively puts that image of the print through the database.
Yeah.
And then that algorithm pulls back 15 of them. And like she said, that alone wouldn't be reliable enough.
Yeah.
Which is why then they filter through those to narrow it down.
Yeah.
And there were some that came back and you thought, well, that obviously isn't a match.
Obviously not. When she was like, oh, this one's got a double loop. And you were like, well, obviously the one that we've got hasn't got a double loop.
But then I guess it's better to be that thorough than it would be otherwise.
And I like that part of it as well because I find that when you watch something on TV in general, even when you are watching the real life documentaries, it sort of makes you think. They go and they get it and they stick it in and it comes out and it says it's this person, this is an exact match to this person, this is the exact fingerprint. And a lot of people don't know that you don't often get full fingerprints to put in the machine, so you might only get a very, very partial print to run through the database, and I think that's why it comes back with probably so many. And with this one being so deteriorated, I expected it to throw back more than 15.
Yes. Yeah, because you've only got that.
Yeah. But then when she did look through them all, there was no match on the database. So we do have this, well, it's not really a problem, but if your fingerprints aren't already on the database and you aren't already known to the police, we can't get a match. And the victim in this case was not on the database, had not committed any crimes through his life. So therefore there was no record of him.
No trace
at all. Yeah, so the only reason people have the fingerprints on the database is when they've been arrested for something, they've had the fingerprints taken and they've been convicted.
Yeah.
And police officers
or if you're in
CSIs and people like that, scientists, do actually have to have their fingerprints and DNA taken to get put on the database. That's just for elimination purposes.
Yeah, and like cross-contamination, effectively.
And also, if you get your house burgled or your car burgled, obviously you need your prints for elimination, but they don't actually go onto the database.
Yeah, they wouldn't keep those.
Yeah, they wouldn't keep hold of those. But in this case, I feel like if his fingerprints were already on the fingerprint database, it would have made this case a lot easier wouldn't it? Yeah, because they'd have obviously been able to identify the victim. Yeah.
So we then know that we can't find a match, a name based on his fingerprints. So again, then we go back to the freezer and hope that the freezer can give us more of an indication. And like we said, they went to the property, they'd spoken to neighbours, and then obviously the next thing that we'd do is look at the tenancy.
Yes.
So the police officers looked at the tenancy and they saw that it was just one single man that was the resident of that property.
Yeah, I suppose because the neighbours thought that it was a father and son, that wouldn't specifically have raised alarm bells, because the father could have been on the tenancy and the son could have been living with them. So to start with, as this was going through, I feel like this was quite a roller coaster of emotions, because you're like, there's so many questions that you want to find out. Who are these people?
And then they actually found that due to one of the disturbances previously, the house had actually been attended by police officers. Was it a few months prior? It
was 9 months.
9 months prior.
Yeah. So the next door neighbour had actually reported that there was a disturbance in the property, and the police had obviously gone round to investigate. And it's really good that the police wear the body cam footage.
Yeah, they've got the dash cam footage. Well, I say dash cam.
Near enough.
Body cam footage.
But I think that's good because, you could go in somewhere and take photographs, or the police could have taken notes during that visit.
Yeah.
But just looking over the footage, you could see so much more about the person.
Yeah, body language,
in general,
reaction,
how
demeanour,
he was acting. And you sort of can build up a bit of a perspective from that, a lot better than you could from a load of notes.
From a practical perspective as well, it makes a lot of sense because officers are incredibly busy all the time.
Yeah.
And if you've got officers at a scene for a number of hours that can't get off the job, but then equally you've got another team that are investigating a potential murder and they need information fast, it'd be no good waiting for them to be able to speak to the people that had attended the scene all those months ago, when they've got to keep things moving.
And they might not even remember everything from the scene. You can look back at your notes and say, oh yeah, I do sort of remember that person. But other than that, the things that might have slipped your mind, how many more scenes have they attended since then? How many people have they spoken to since then?
Whereas on this occasion, they were able to say, right, okay, and then they got the footage straight up and then just watched it then and there in the office.
Yeah, and it actually shows you the footage on the programme. And when they knock on the door, it's actually a guy called Damien Johnson that opens the door. And he looks like, from what they can gather, the younger male that is living at the property, along along with the victim. What did you think when he opened the door? How did you think, in general, he was acting?
I don't know about you, but when I open the door, even if I'm not sure who it is, might be delivery man, might be the milkman, I open the door. I just open it.
Yeah.
Enough so I can tell who it is.
See who it is. Yeah.
This guy, very cautious.
Yes,
now
he was,
again,
yeah.
there's different reasons for that.
Yeah.
But if there is a peephole in the door and you have only opened it, he effectively opened it slightly ajar and put his head round.
I didn't see that he did that, though, because there was a chain on. Because I know some people open it because there's a chain on and look around it to see who it is. But I didn't see a chain on the door. No. So he had actually just opened it that much to look. Yeah,
just to see. And then I got the impression very standoffish.
Yes.
Now, some people do have a negative perception of the police, but he very much gave off an aura of not wanting anyone to disturb him, nor did he want anyone going into that house.
Yeah. As soon as he sort of opened the door, in my mind, I know you shouldn't be like, you shouldn't put anything, you shouldn't.
Well, you do. You've got natural.
I was like, oh yes, suspicious.
You're natural.
He's
you
suspicious.
love the term suspicious.
He was looking very suspicious.
Very suspicious.
And just his demeanour in general. But then he was quite. What's the word for it? Like skittish as well.
Yeah.
A bit all over the place.
Yeah, so the police effectively went there. They said there'd been reports of a disturbance and basically just said, is there anyone else in there with you? And he straight away said, like, no, I live on my own. And they were like, have you got any friends or family round? And he said, no, I'm here on my own.
He actually said, my dad's died, didn't he? Oh, was it not my dad?
I think at that point, they were like, well, in that case, can we just come in and have a chat with you?
Yeah.
And again, he really didn't want to let them in to begin with. And if it were me, I'd be like, yes, of course. What do you need?
Yeah.
Do you need a cup of tea? But he didn't, did he? No. And he did let them in. But like you say, very kind of guarded. And I think it was at that point that they said, do you live, are you just here on your own? And he said, yes, I used to live here with my father, but he died. And now it's just me.
Yeah.
And then oddly went into quite a lot of detail, I found. He went from one extreme to the other. He kind of said he didn't want anything to do with the police and he didn't want them to come in. But then without them really asking, he started saying that he was the carer for his dad and that they'd lived there for years and that his father had then got dementia. So it was just him and his dad. And his dad used to get angry sometimes, but it all just seemed a bit odd.
Yeah, he was sort of not volunteering anything, but volunteering too much at the same time.
Yeah.
So I couldn't really work him out in general.
No.
But is what the police could do then when he said, my father's died, they could actually go back to the council and say, did anyone report this death?
Yes.
In general, because if he was, the tenancy should have been changed over to Damien's name and he should have been the sole tenant. Mm-hmm. And the council said, didn't they?
Yeah.
No one's reported the death. The death's not being reported in general.
Well, I think after that first disturbance, I think that was it, wasn't it? They just spoke to him and left. I don't think anything happened after that.
Yeah.
But it was then, obviously, when they're now looking at
back
it.
To now.
Yeah, we're back to now.
We're back to now, yeah.
Looking at it in a different light.
Yeah.
And it was at that point that they were said, oh, well, that's interesting, because we now know that there's one registered tenant. He's now mentioned that his father's died. And like you say, we've now checked it and there has been no registered death. And it was at that point that they actually found out that Damien wasn't his actual name, was it? That was just a name he was using.
Right.
Not sure why he'd changed his name.
And why would you specifically choose? Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
I just feel like, did he change his name for a reason? Had he done something previously?
Yeah.
Like, as in, I don't mean like murder or anything. You could have changed it if maybe he was in trouble or he was running away from something. Or
you just don't like your name.
Or you just don't like your name. But yeah, I mean, it's quite extreme.
But then they also discovered that John Wainright wasn't actually his father.
Yeah.
He then was supposedly a father figure. but they weren't related.
They'd known each other for 27 years, so quite a long time. And that's when Damien had become the carer when John had got dementia.
Yes.
But, you know, he did seem in some cases quite upset about John dying. And if you've known someone for that long, it is quite a shock when you've spent that long just you two together.
Yes.
And Damien didn't have any other family, and John didn't have family, did he?
No.
So, you know, it is a really sad case as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Must have been quite lonely for both of them, really.
So we then, again, we skip to them investigating the flat. So at this point, Damien isn't living there. Damien's moved out. And the flat is derelict, effectively.
It's empty. There was nothing in there at all,
No.
was there? Like,
Even half of the wall was kind of, not even crumbled, just torn down.
the one thing, though, that I couldn't understand about this is that the council cleared out the flat 9 months after Damien had left.
Yes.
Why was it so long?
I mean, there's a lot of properties.
Yeah, but
isn't
do you know
there?
when there's like people waiting
I know.
for
Oh, I know.
properties?
I know.
As in, like, I obviously do work with the homeless charity, and to try and get
So
someone
frustrating.
in somewhere is so hard. And when there's properties available
Empty.
and empty and ready for it to just be emptied and someone else put in,
Yeah.
like, I don't know the logical side of
No.
it, but for it to take 9 months seems to me like it's quite drastic.
It must be
Quite a long amount of
backlogged.
time.
I
It
know,
must just.
yeah.
I know it must be backlog, and obviously none of us work for the council, so we can't really comment
No.
on that. But I just thought the space of time was quite
Yeah.
ridiculous, really.
know,
When you've got
yeah.
people waiting,
Empty, yeah.
yeah.
So the CSIs then go in, process this empty flat, and there really wasn't a lot to see. They cleared it pretty quickly.
Yeah.
There wasn't a lot in there. But what they did then find was an empty cupboard area, but it didn't have like a door on it or anything, did it?
No, it reminded me a bit like an old like airing cupboard or something.
Yeah.
Um,
And they could then tell that was where the freezer was suspected to have been, because there was effectively liquid,
Putrefied
which was-
remains.
Yeah, which liquid that had come from the freezer, which was the purified remains, and there were a lot of dead maggots that were in this kind of liquid. So the freezer obviously wasn't there, but they could tell that that's where the freezer had been, and they said that bit of the house specifically had a real smell to it.
did you notice though that they said that's where the freezer had been, but there was no plug socket
Yes.
to plug the freezer in? So the whole time that freezer had been in the house, in that room with the body in it, it had never been plugged in.
Been on.
So it wasn't as if anything had happened to sort of preserve the body.
No.
Because the freezer would obviously slow down the whole decomposition process.
Yes.
And it had started leaking out. And imagine the smell for the next door neighbours, but also the flat below
Yeah,
as
no,
well. If it's
definitely.
leaking through the ceiling, the
Yeah.
flat below would have been able to smell it too.
Yeah. And another thing that I was going to ask you about, actually, because as I've just mentioned, maggots are a natural thing to expect to see when you've had a body, because as we know, flies are attracted to the scent of a body, and then they then lay their eggs, and it is those eggs that then become the maggots that feed on the body. But these maggots were dead. Now, generally, what you find is that they feed and feed and feed until they move away from the body and become a pupa before they turn back into a fly. What would cause the maggots to have died? Is that just a lack of food?
See, yeah, I thought this because you'd expect the maggots to have then gone to a fly to being able to then fly away.
Yeah.
So why would there be like some random dead maggots? And there was
left.
quite a few, weren't there?
Yeah,
Random
there
dead
were, yeah.
maggots. And the only reason that I can think for this is if the maggots had obviously fed on the body, and then because they weren't feeding on the actual body, they were feeding on the sort of liquid around the body, there was not enough for them to feed on. So instead of them doing the full cycle, they may have got to the first stage or the second stage and then not had enough food to get them to the next stage.
So just died.
And then they've just died there.
Because they do keep eating, don't they? Once they start eating, they keep feeding. But yeah, I thought that was interesting.
So that's the only thing I can think of. The lack of food for them would have killed them off.
Yeah.
There and then.
And then another thing to mention was the fact that, again, they'd obviously got this, I keep wanting to say dash cam, because they've got this footage from the police officers attending the flat back when they did. They actually saw that there was a door on this cupboard at the time, but obviously, because there was the door at the time, they didn't think anything of it, and they'd kind of just
walked past it, didn't they? You could see the body cam footage just drifting past the door, and you're like, it's there, just open the door. Yeah.
But again, that makes sense, because if there was a door there at the time, the smell probably wouldn't have got through as much, because if the police would have smelt it,
because
they would have investigated.
When the next door neighbour reported the bad smells, surely that was a long time after, because this was when there was the disturbance.
Yeah.
So if it was a long time after, the police would have known that smell straight away when they went in there.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking at this point, he couldn't have been long in there.
Yeah.
And obviously not as decomposed, therefore wouldn't be smelling as much.
So the smell was reported in November, which would suggest that it could have been 9 months prior. He could have died 9 months prior to him being found, is effectively what they discovered, wasn't it?
Yeah.
But yes.
So 9 months is a long time as well, isn't it? But luckily, from the body cam footage that they got, they'd also now could see exactly what Damien looked like.
Yes.
They could put his name into the database, and they could find him, couldn't they? So is what they did was then they'd put a warrant out for his arrest. They would go and get Damien and bring Damien in for questioning. And when they brought him in for questioning, I don't think this was what I was expecting. You know,
just him?
No, like he had the pre-prepared statement.
Okay.
And it was, the stuff he was saying in the statement was, he sort of just not admitted to killing him or anything, but I feel like he was very...
It was very blasé.
Yeah, and he was saying, I'm very upset by this, and, and I just thought it was a bit weird, if you ask me. I didn't know what to say about it. I was like... it's a bit of an odd situation. So if it was me and someone had brought me in for questioning and I was in Damien's situation, and there was nothing wrong, and maybe I'd made a few mistakes along the way, I would just be saying, look, I'm so sorry, like this is what happened. But I wouldn't do the whole pre-prepared statement. I'd say it myself. It's as if he'd done the pre-prepared statement in case he said anything he shouldn't say.
Yeah,
sort of thing.
He was going to get caught out, kind of thing.
Yeah, because I would have just been like, I'm so sorry, I couldn't let this person go. Like, this is what happened.
But equally, why did he think he was being arrested? Do you know what I mean? Like, if it were me, I'd be like, is everything...
Because I think they arrested him on suspicion of murder.
They did. Oh, okay.
I'm sure that when they went round, they said you're arrested on suspicion of murder, because when they showed you in his house arresting him, he was like, what, like what murder? Who have I murdered? Like sort of thing.
Right,
who is it? Because he was obviously quite confused then.
Yeah.
But then when he got to the police station, he must have obviously spoken to the solicitor and then done the pre-prepared statement. But I wouldn't have done a pre-prepared statement.
Yeah, I guess, although for some people, I guess they will just do exactly as they are told if they have spoken to a solicitor. I don't really know what I'd do in that situation, because I think I would just trust whoever I've
spoken
solicitor
to. Yeah.
If they tell me to, I would probably do it, because they'd know better than me.
Yeah, I suppose. Yeah, I've never been in that situation.
I was going to say, I don't know.
We've never been arrested, so
But in this written statement, he basically, again, it was very brief, very matter of fact, and he said that he was traumatized by the death, the natural death. That was crucial.
Yep.
He said he was traumatized by the natural death of John. He had found John's body, but because he was that traumatized and in a state of shock, he didn't know what to do, and therefore had put John's body in the freezer.
And he said, didn't he didn't want to let him go. He didn't want John to be away from him. So the whole thing of putting him in the freezer was to keep him
nearby.
Keep him nearby a bit longer, and they'd not been away from each other, and he was that distraught, wasn't it?
And then he said that days had gone by with him still in the freezer, and by that point he was too scared to actually then report him as being dead.
Yeah.
Because he didn't know how to go about doing it. But again, I found that a little bit strange, because if you want to keep him nearby, now we have done a lot of research on other killers, and they tend to be the ones who will make a conscious effort of keeping the body in a state that they can kind of pose or have malleable, or they will keep them in a freezer which is on, is my thinking.
Yes.
So if you wanted to keep the body in a state that you could return to, you would need that freezer to be on.
I think it's horrible to watch someone that you supposedly love decompose in a corner in front of you and not give them the right to a funeral or a burial.
Yeah, well, it's just respect, isn't it? Really?
Yeah,
do you know what I mean?
It's contradicting.
If you respect someone and you've lived with them for that length of time, why on earth would you want to see them in such a compromising situation, even in death?
Yeah.
So that was, it did seem
I did
strange.
think it was a little bit conflicting, and the police said that after their statement, this statement from Damien, they continued their investigations. And did you see about the freezer when it was bought?
Yes.
So he bought the freezer on the day that John died. So he ordered the freezer online on that exact day that he died. So it was almost like as soon as he died, he thought, right, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to put him in this freezer. But the freezer didn't arrive till 3 days later. That's why he didn't get put in the freezer until a little bit later. So he would already have started some signs of decomposition before he went in the freezer. And if you were in that much of a state of shock and you were that upset about someone you love dying, like, I'm sorry, but if something happened to Jay, I wouldn't on that exact same day think, I know, I'll put him in a freezer. Let me go online and search on Amazon chest freezers available that can fit a body in.
No, and he just said that he'd seen it and it was cheap.
And it was for his frozen food.
And it was for his frozen food. But then again, that didn't seem to make any sense, because
your friends died. Why are you shopping for a freezer in general?
Yeah.
That'd be the last thing on your mind, unless it's for a reason.
Yeah.
And he was just saying, wasn't he? Oh, it's cheap. It was a good deal. That's why I wanted to get this freezer.
Yeah, like we're talking about someone that has been murdered and you're looking at a good deal.
And who cares about a good deal on a freezer when your friend's dead?
Yeah.
Like,
so at this point, obviously they're doing financial investigations, which is how they'd found this receipt for the freezer, and they could track it back from a timeline perspective.
Yeah.
But they'd also been looking at social media, hadn't they, as well? Yeah. So they'd then got Damien's social media, and they'd found that, again, on the day that he's suspected to have died, he had posted a tribute, effectively, on Facebook, and said that John was his world and that he didn't know what to do now, because he was lost without him. And they were all kind of really
very heartfelt.
Yeah, really deep and heartfelt messages that basically gave you the impression of someone that was completely lost without.
Yeah, and it wasn't just one post either. It was a post obviously on the day or around the time that he died, and then a little bit after there'd be a post like how much he was missing John, and then like on the year anniversary, or it was like there was constant tributes to John, wasn't there? So it's like, it wasn't just, well, I didn't feel like it was just one post for show and then, oh, that's it, it's done with, I don't have to do anything else.
Yeah, there were numerous.
It was constant posts, which, you know, you think, I know grief hits people in different ways, and we've got to think about it from maybe that perspective as well, and how he was feeling. The only person that you've got in the world has just died.
Yeah. And they'd lived together since, I think it was 2015, they said that they'd
when he was his carer.
Yeah. So again, that is a long time to have lived with someone.
Yeah. So if we go to now the evidence that we would have a look at from when they were looking at John in general and looking more at the odontology side of it, because I think this is a really
fascinating,
a really interesting side. And I've met some really, really amazing forensic odontologists in the work that I've done. And I am always just fascinated
Yeah.
by them.
Yeah.
And I don't know if it's because I do the anthropology, which is obviously the bones and the skeleton side of it, and teeth also come in as a big part of identifying a victim.
Yeah.
But when I've worked alongside them, I just stand there and I'm asking them questions and I'm like, oh my God, this is fascinating. Like,
What
this is
struck
amazing.
me is how much of it wasn't actually specifically teeth.
Specific science as well, don't you think?
Well, I don't know. It wasn't specifically teeth related, was it? He was
No.
looking at the whole like jaw structure and the bone, the facial bone structure, effectively.
Yeah.
For more information that would help align everything.
Yeah, so just in case you don't know, we're talking about, like, everyone's a forensic expert out here, but a forensic odontologist is primarily someone with a dental background who would then help work in forensic investigations and help identify people from their teeth and their dental records.
So again, generally, you think of that as being teeth impressions on a victim, maybe, or teeth impressions if we've got food that's been found, or again to identify someone from their teeth if we have teeth. But again, this was where I found it interesting.
Yeah,
because
it's a little bit different.
It opened up a whole nother element of odontology, really, didn't it?
Yeah, so it was actually Dr. Ronald Kubel, I think is how you say it.
Yeah.
And he was the forensic odontologist in Sheffield. And just seeing how he worked in general was quite fascinating, I thought.
Yeah.
So he was supplied with photos of John from, I think it was his Facebook profile, wasn't it?
Yeah, so we'd got photos from the police officers that were doing the investigation. So like you say, there would have just been photos that they'd gathered from him. Again, as far as we're aware, John didn't really have any family, so they couldn't get any photos that way. So they would have all been probably from Facebook and stuff like that. So got those from the police officers that were investigating, but then he'd equally got other information from Dr. Lyle, who had then given photography
of the CT scans, wasn't it?
Of the CT scans of the skull. Because again, one thing that was great throughout the documentary is showing the importance of crime scene photography.
Yeah.
It's so crucial at every stage, isn't it? It's just essential. Really.
It's like your whole documentation.
Yeah.
Isn't it, in general?
And so you've got photos of the skull and photos of his head and the body, but then, like you say, you've also got the scans as well. So effectively, it's as many reference points as we can get to try and bolster his investigation.
So what he could do then, once he'd got all these different items, is he could superimpose them. And the 3D images of the skull, he superimposed them over the Facebook photo, and then he looked at the positioning of the eye sockets. He looked at the shape of the nasal cavity.
Yes.
He looked at the shape of the skull in general. Had a look to see if the overlay was consistent with one another.
Yeah.
But even when he was overlaying it, you think, oh yeah, they roundabout look, like they matched up.
Yes.
But for me, obviously, I'm not an expert in that area, and he is. Like, I wouldn't be able to say on that, oh yeah, that definitely 100% was superimposed and it matched perfect.
No.
But obviously he was looking a bit a bit deeper in general.
We should probably note as well that obviously we've got Damien who said that John's died, but because we've got no official reference of death
or records or anything,
and because the post-mortem with fingerprinting didn't bring that result back, we actually have to prove that it is John. And that's effectively what he was doing. So again, you wouldn't think necessarily that an odontologist would be the one that is confirming your victim identification. But in this case, that's what was necessary.
Yeah, so Dr. Ronald Kubel said it fits anatomically, but it's not a 100% identification. He said, I can say that to me, this is what seems to be the match, but it's not 100% science.
No.
But I think from that, they could probably determine that it was John from there, along with
all of the other evidence,
other bits of evidence that they'd got as well. Yeah.
And then if we stay in the facial area, the post-mortem report said that there were signs of trauma to the face from what they could tell. But again, you have to investigate whether that has come from him being forced into the freezer, whether that was pre or post death. You've got to find all that out. You can't just take it as...
And when they sent the CT scan through, there was quite substantial damage.
Yes.
When I first looked at it, I was like, oh God, like that's not just a little bit of damage. It was fractured cheekbones, fractured nose, they had teeth missing.
And there was also open wounds and like lacerations to the gum. But again, through further investigation, they identified that they were from either shortly prior to or at the time of death. So again, that does suggest more of a struggle than a peaceful natural death.
Yes, it does, definitely. And if we just go back to the post-mortem as well, is what they do at a post-mortem to try and determine the cause of death. They actually take tissue samples from different organs, so they can look at them under the microscope and see if there's anything there that's particularly concerning. And the doctor did actually say, didn't he, there was, I think it was cardiovascular, there was something, there was something wrong there, which would suggest that... I can't remember if it were his veins that was widened by something that was in there, some sort of build-up. But he did say, yes, this does look pretty bad, but it's often not a...
No, it wouldn't
have led to an immediate death sort of thing. So they can actually look, whereas Damien had said it's natural causes, they could look at every single organ to find out what is the problem with that organ, which I think was very clever.
And there didn't seem to be anything that would be like, yes, that would have...
100%, that's what did it. And the cause of death was actually undetermined in the end, wasn't it?
It was, But at this point, because they could confirm that these injuries were either at or around the time of death, they then had reason to effectively bring Damien in again because there's further evidence and question him specifically regarding the incident of his suspected murder. Yeah, and there's just still at the moment so many questions, isn't there? I feel like the whole investigation, I know they obviously have made progress as we've gone along, but I feel like you go in like a loop and you think, oh yeah, this is going to be it, and then it comes back to the beginning, you're like, no determination for the time of death, and then natural, he said he died of natural causes. It's almost like you go all the way around and then it's back to the beginning, you're like, we're back to the beginning again. And then you've got all these facial injuries, but they say yes, they're probably at the time of death, but they wouldn't have been enough to
kill him.
To be the cause of death. So again, that's still undetermined. So as you say, it's quite up and down. But Damien, they obviously questioned Damien about it, confronted him about these lacerations, the missing teeth, etc. And he basically said that he had put him head first into the freezer. But they said basically that wouldn't have been enough to cause such injuries. And then they asked whether or not there'd ever been any violence within the home previously, to which Damien had actually said that it was John that could be violent. And that because of John's dementia, he would get confused and sometimes lash out.
Which also is quite common.
It is, But then again, we don't have any proof of that.
And we didn't have proof of the dementia in the first place, did we?
No.
Wouldn't there be a medical diagnosis if you had got dementia?
And they interviewed, obviously, a couple of Damien's like associates or friends that had actually been round to the flat, and they'd said that they'd never seen John be violent before. But again, John is now trying to paint himself in a positive light, because he said that whenever that did occur, he would just walk away from the situation and let John calm down. So he was very much trying to detach himself from any form of violence within that home, and create a bit of distance.
And he said when he left the house and when he came back, that John wouldn't know that, he wouldn't know it had happened because his dementia was that sort of bad.
But still was denying that he'd ever, because at one point they asked him if he'd ever striked him to try and calm him down. And all he said was, oh no, I'd never do that. He said, I once grabbed him
his arms or
his
something
arm,
to sit him down.
To sit him down, yeah. But again, it was very much more like for John's own good rather than
making him look like a good carer.
Violence.
Yeah. So in this situation now, we've got an admission that is put him in the freezer. The main thing we probably need to know now is when John was put in the freezer, was he alive?
Yes.
So they had a look, didn't they, on the inside of the freezer for fingerprints, because if you've been put in a freezer alive, you'll be touching the side, you'll be trying to push the lid, you'll be banging on there trying to get out. So looking on the inside of the freezer is obviously the next logical step here. They actually used super glue fuming on the inside.
Yes.
Which I thought was quite good. And did you see the size of the fuming cabinet they had? Because obviously it went into it, they wheeled into it. It was a huge fuming cabinet that they put it in. And she used a really posh word for super glue fuming, and I can't remember what it was.
No, I can't.
I'm sure it began with C. And I thought, I've not heard that word for a while since I was at uni.
And they
I forgot about that.
also used like a spray adhesive almost, didn't they?
Yeah.
So that because it's a white freezer, they wanted to be able to see the fingerprints as clearly as possible.
Yeah.
So they used like an adhesive spray on top, which then made it almost like a yellow colour, didn't it?
Yeah, and then that actually fluoresces under UV light as well. So you could just put the UV light over it.
Make it a lot more obvious.
And it would be a lot more obvious, because with the super glue fuming, I've only done it on a much smaller scale than with a freezer. And super glue fuming is often used on sort of plastic items and can be really good in the use of fingerprinting weapons. So if you've got like a gun handle and you want to fingerprint that, super glue fuming would be a good way to retrieve fingerprints.
The other thing that you've got to consider as well on something like a freezer that's been handled by so many people, you've obviously had whoever's touched it in the flat, but then you've had the people from the council that have come to clear it. Then you've had the waste disposal people who have obviously been handling it without realising. So that's a lot of prints on prints. And another thing that we talk about is the fact that when you're looking for evidence, you're looking for the things that are most likely to give you good evidence. And prints on prints on prints, unfortunately,
is not great.
And they didn't actually find really any prints on the outside.
No, they didn't. There was I think there was a couple of prints found on the inside of the lid, but they weren't anything to do with John or...
No, well, that was interesting, wasn't it? Because obviously they were expecting that if there were going to be anyone's... They found a print on the lid of the freezer, and at that point you think, well, if it's going to be anyone's, it would be John's if he'd been put in while he was still alive. But they didn't come back as a match to John.
No.
Which would then suggest that they belong to whoever has put the lid down on the freezer. So that, again, is crucial evidence then, isn't it, really?
Yeah. So we think now from this, they were saying we would have thought that John was put in the freezer after
his death.
But then they also looked into the financial side of it.
So obviously they've tracked the freezer back through financial records. But then it doesn't just stop there, does it? We don't just look at a receipt for a freezer and say...
Just one receipt.
Okay, that's it. We say, okay, we found what we need. So what they actually did then was keep going through John's financial records, basically, and found that, again, you would presume if someone had died, they'd no longer be using their bank cards or their carer's allowance. But in actual fact, John's cards were still being used, all quite small transactions, and they were all from like the local corner shop close to the flat that they'd lived. But again, it was all after John's death. So it can't have been him that was using this card. And although there were small transactions, in total they totted it up, and it was over £17,000, wasn't it, that had actually been spent on the card. And like you said, if it was reported, the payments to John would have been stopped anyway, wouldn't they? Like his benefit payments, and the carers' payments to Damien would have been stopped. So not only was he using John's card, he was still receiving the carers' payments to himself, which I think they said the carers' amount
amounted to 250 something pound. I think that was a month, so it's not
Yeah.
not a great deal. But then with the £17,000 on top that you're using from John's card,
And you're then living in a free flat because he wasn't paying anything for the flat. You've got free accommodation.
But then I wonder why Damien moved out eventually and just left the freezer in there.
The only thing that I can think, because they actually found, when he was arrested the first time, they actually found him in a neighbouring county, didn't they? They found him in Derbyshire.
Derbyshire, yeah.
So the only thing that I could think is that he kind of realised that at some point his time would be up, because obviously he had just left the freezer there.
Yeah.
And
thought,
so
I'll get
somebody's
away.
going to find, do you know what I mean? Somebody's going to find it at some point. So, yeah, unless it was just a case of he decided to distance himself from it.
Yeah, maybe.
But that now gives them motive, because you've now got someone spending money that isn't his, and you've got Damien that's also still receiving payments that he's no longer entitled to.
Yeah.
So he's now got motive to have, one, not declared John dead, but also potentially to have murdered John for that money.
For financial gain. Yeah.
And so, again, they can't prove manner of death, but they've got enough at this point to charge Damien. And it went to Crown Court, as it does, and the charges that were then brought against Damien were for fraud. So it was 3 counts of fraud, actually, wasn't it?
Yeah, 3.
3 counts of fraud, and then 1 count of an unlawful burial.
Preventing an unlawful.
Preventing a lawful burial, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So again, it just, even though you know that you can't possibly get convicted for murder when they haven't got the evidence, when you see it come up on the screen at the end, it is so frustrating.
Yeah.
Because you think they know, effectively, you've got as much evidence as possible, but you just physically haven't got the proof. Forensic science is based in proving enough to a court that something is beyond reasonable doubt. So even though you know you've not got enough evidence, it is still so frustrating that he hadn't been charged with that.
Yeah, and when they worked all the timings out in the end, initially they thought that John's body had been in the freezer for 9 months.
Yeah.
And when they looked at it in more detail, it turned out that John's body had been in there for around 2 years.
2 years.
So maybe because the decomposition was so advanced, I feel like that's why they didn't get the evidence they needed to convict Damien.
Yeah.
It's difficult with a body that's that decomposed when you've basically got nothing left. They're lucky they got an identification.
Yeah, definitely.
On John in the first place. It's just a sad case, isn't it?
Yeah,
and
horrendous.
Damien was only sentenced, for what?
Yeah.
For his charges, it seems like a normal sentence, but if you believe that he did the murder, it's obviously nothing, and he'd be out in less time.
But again, it was almost mitigated because he'd pleaded guilty, which was why.
Yes, so if you plead guilty, I think you get 25%, is it, off your sentence?
Yeah, so he pleaded guilty and then was sentenced with a 2-year sentence.
But then on good behaviour as well, he would have been out in 1 year, if that, for the stuff that he'd done. So we'll never know, and it's not for us to say, he did it or he didn't do it. But I think in this situation, there just wasn't enough evidence for the conviction.
But the one thing that I really liked, which kind of rounded up the episode on the BBC, and I'll use it to round up our episode today, was that the CSI said that the work they do is effectively to do the right thing. It's doing the right thing. And like you say, we might not have got all of the evidence, or they might not have got what they wanted in terms of a conviction, but it's about doing the right thing.
Yeah.
And now John has been found. We have got that identification.
Yeah.
If he has got family out there somewhere, they will now at least know what happened to him.
And he's been laid to rest.
Yeah. So it's about doing the right thing to as much of an extent as you can, really, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. So that is our case for this week wrapped up.
Yes.
Another case wrapped up.
No.
I am actually quite liking these case studies. I feel like as we're getting into them a little bit more, we're getting better with our storytelling.
Yeah.
And,
Well, I hope so.
sometimes we start and we're really uptight. Like, oh God, we just want to do justice for the person. We want it to come across really well as like for the victim. And then now I think we're relaxing a little bit more into it, and it'll come across more natural. So let us know what you think to our case studies, guys. Let us know. And we have actually got some reviews.
We have. So thank you ever so much.
Thank you
anyone
for
that's left us a review.
The reviews, we've got them on Spotify and on Apple. Yeah. So keep reviewing us, because we want to keep doing better, don't we?
Yeah, we do. But that's it for now. So again, make sure you've downloaded the episode. Follow us on any platform you like.
All of our social media. So you can listen to us on audio, but if you do want to sit and watch us, don't know why people would want to actually watch the whole thing all the way through. We prefer the audio. Yeah. But if you do want to watch us, then you can head over to YouTube, and we have all our short clips on Instagram and TikTok. I think we're on every platform possible at the moment. Facebook.
Equally, we want to know what cases you want us to cover. We've done quite local ones so far. We found out we've got a few listeners. Our listenership is going up in America and other countries, so that's crazy. That's really cool.
We're going worldwide.
So, like Pitbull. So if you want us to cover... So if you want us to cover any cases that are from where you are from, then please let us know. Keep us updated on social media, and we will see you next week.
Bye.
Take care.